A scream drowned in linen, boots scraping on wet stone, and the crack of wood as a body is forced to kneel. The morning air stank of iron and damp moss. Somewhere beyond the walls, a raven barked once, then fell silent. A low fog rolled over Tower Green like a shroud, muffling the murmurs of the gathered witnesses. The woman they brought out was 67 years old. Thin, stooped, but still proud, her spine unbent, her silver hair uncombed, trailing over the white of her shift. She wore no hood, no jewelry. Only the indignity of being paraded like cattle toward a butcher's block that would not even be offered to her. The executioner's hands trembled. He had not done this before. Not like this. There would be no scaffold, no formal pronouncement, no final prayer, no blindfold, just a panicked headsman and a noble woman they called a traitor. This was the fate of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, cousin to 2 kings, governess to a queen, and the last living symbol of a dynasty Henry VIII wanted erased. Today we uncover the grisly end of a woman too royal to live and too stubborn to die, the beheading that took 11 strikes to finish. The Countess had not been condemned by jury, nor tried in any court. Her guilt was a signature, scrawled hastily by the king on a piece of parchment, years after her imprisonment began. Attainted by act of parliament, without evidence, without defense. A legal phantom. The Tower had become her purgatory since 1539. By 1541, it was her tomb. And yet, on that May morning she walked out under her own power. No chains. No fetters. Just the brittle dignity of a woman who had nursed children, buried siblings, and stood in the court of kings. Margaret Pole had once sat at the table with Queen Catherine of Aragon. She had walked beside the Princess Mary in her childhood, wiping her tears when Anne Boleyn stole her crown. In quieter times she had embroidered altar cloths and kept herb sachets in her sleeves to ward off the plague. Her fingers still smelled faintly of dried lavender. But now, she was no longer Lady Salisbury. No longer a countess. Just one more inconvenient remnant of the Plantagenet line, a bone the Tudors could not quite swallow. The yeoman of the guard hesitated as she reached the execution ground. "There is no block," she said flatly. "Where shall I lay my head?" The guards exchanged glances. The headsman stepped forward. His axe was dull, his robe unwashed. Some said he was a drunkard pulled from the crowd. Others claimed he was merely afraid, frightened by her titles, her age, the ghost of her lineage. Margaret looked him in the eyes and stepped away from him. "I am no traitor," she said quietly. "God knows that." Then she turned her back and walked in a slow circle, unwilling to kneel. She would not assist her own execution, would not bow to fear, would not die like a criminal. The first strike missed her neck entirely. Gasps erupted. The axe hit her shoulder, ripping through flesh but glancing off bone. She screamed, not from fear but rage. She staggered, tried to rise, her thin arms flailing. Blood soaked her shift, spreading like a tide down her back. The second strike carved a diagonal path across her scapula. The third cracked her skull. She was still moving, crawling, screaming curses in Latin, calling down saints and archangels. The executioner backed away, then lunged again. The fourth strike opened her side. The fifth lodged in her spine. She did not die quickly. Witnesses would later claim she tried to stand after the sixth blow, that she attempted to run. One guard claimed she cried for her son. Another swore she uttered only one word, "Murderers." It was the seventh blow that finally brought her down fully. But her heart still beat. The eighth splintered her shoulder blade. The ninth and 10th blows hit bone, dull thuds against a rib cage meant for royalty. It was not until the 11th stroke that her head was fully severed. Even then the headsman stumbled, dropping it. Blood pooled on the stone, slow and dark as ink. A priest turned away, white-faced. One of the onlookers vomited in the grass. Another, a young servant girl, fainted. The fog swallowed the scene in silence. Margaret's body was buried without ceremony within the Tower grounds, likely near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, beneath a simple marker. The woman who had once presided over great halls and noble feasts now lay in a pit among traitors, poisoners, and queens undone. Historians still debate whether her execution was a calculated act of vengeance or a last-minute political purge meant to appease Henry's mounting paranoia. Some believe her son Reginald Pole's outspoken resistance to the king's reforms sealed her fate. Others argue her very existence, unbroken, unbent, was enough. Her hair, it said, turned fully white in prison. She had suffered cold winters, disease, and the slow death of memory. They say she once spent an entire month weaving crosses from the rushes of her cell floor, whispering psalms to no one. There is no record of her final meal. But we know she once favored pottage of dried peas, spiced with garlic and sage, humble peasant food. The sort of thing her jailers might have mocked her for eating. The axe that struck her was never used again. She had been born into war. Birthed during the twilight of one dynasty and the ruthless ascent of another. Her childhood lullabies were the whispers of rebellion and the creak of gallows ropes. Margaret Plantagenet, later Margaret Pole, was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of King Edward IV and King Richard III. But while her bloodline shimmered with royal legitimacy, it also dripped with betrayal. Her father had been drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, executed for treason by his own brother. She was 3 years old. The court that raised her was one of masks and daggers. A place where courtiers bowed with poisoned rings and smiled through sharpened teeth. And when the Tudors took the throne after Bosworth Field, Margaret's last name became a curse. She was married off, strategically, to Sir Richard Pole, a relative of Henry VI's mother. It was a pairing of politics, not affection. But Margaret made it work, bearing 5 children and serving dutifully at court. After Richard's death, she wore widowhood like armor, maneuvering the brutal chessboard of Tudor politics with care. What makes her story so chilling is not just the way she died, but how long she had to survive. She was governess to Princess Mary, a trusted companion to Queen Catherine of Aragon. She held the prestigious title of Countess of Salisbury in her own right, one of the last noble women of her generation to possess such wealth and power independently. In her stately manor at Warblington Castle, she oversaw not just estates but diplomacy. Her letters were fluent in Latin and French, her accounts meticulous. She was no naive dowager, no relic of a gentler past. Margaret Pole was sharp, strategic, and aware of exactly how dangerous that made her. She saw the warning signs long before they struck. When Henry VIII split from Rome, Margaret's sympathies did not lie with the king. Her son, Reginald Pole, became one of the fiercest critics of the English Reformation. His writings accused Henry of heresy, of tyranny, of betraying both the Pope and God. Margaret knew what that meant. In Tudor England, the crimes of sons were not sins alone. They were family stains, guilt by bloodline. But she did not run. She did not denounce Reginald. She remained silent. And silence in Tudor England was treason enough. By 1538, the hunt for dissenters had turned into a purge. The so-called Exeter Conspiracy, a vague, likely fabricated plot, was the noose Henry needed. Several nobles were arrested, including Margaret's other sons, Geoffrey and Henry. Geoffrey cracked under torture. Henry was executed. Margaret, by then in her 60s, was interrogated for hours. Her household was searched. They found nothing but a tunic bearing the 5 wounds of Christ, a popular Catholic symbol. That was enough. She was arrested in November 1538 and imprisoned in the Tower. For the first 18 months she had no formal charge. No indictment. Just the cold reality of stone walls and the sound of other prisoners screaming in the night. She endured her captivity with a stiffness that some mistook for pride. Others called it sanctity. One Tower official described her as a woman of great age, long afflicted, and yet miraculously unbroken. She embroidered, read scripture, and refused to confess to a crime she did not commit. And Henry awaited. Historians still argue whether her death was inevitable or the result of a last-minute fury. Some say her son's latest letter, an open denunciation of the king, pushed Henry over the edge. Others whisper of political opportunism, that her estates were simply too rich to ignore. But to the court she had become an emblem, a living reminder of the old blood, the old ways, the Plantagenet thorn in the Tudor side. She had outlived 2 kings, 2 queens, and a score of rivals. That was not luck. That was defiance. And that too had to die. There are fragments of her Tower life that survive, scraps of letters, second-hand accounts. It said that her room was small but dry, and that she kept herbs tucked beneath her mattress to mask the stench. She read from a hand-copied book of hours, smuggled to her by a sympathetic nun. One jailer claimed she would sit for hours with her back to the door, speaking aloud to the saints. The gossip, of course, was that she had gone mad. But then again, in Tudor England, refusing to weep was often mistaken for insanity. Perhaps the strangest detail of all, despite her rank, she was given no trial. Even Anne Boleyn had received that courtesy. Margaret did not. Her guilt was inked into law by Parliament, not proven. She was attainted retroactively, her very existence reclassified as treasonous. And so the date was set. May 27, 1541. But the court moved quietly. No grand scaffold, no public procession. It was to be a private affair. A footnote in the shadow of the tower. A whisper of death rather than a roar. Yet it was her death, not her long service or noble blood, that would make history tremble. It began with silence. No formal summons. No visit from a priest. No last confession. No chance to write a final letter to her sons. The orders came from above, transmitted like poison through layers of bureaucracy until they reached the jailer's hand, simple, absolute, and final. Margaret Pole was to die. In Tudor politics, death was never random. It was the closing move of a long, deliberate game, a maneuver choreographed not in courtrooms, but in corridors and chambers where loyalty could be bought and suspicion was always for sale. The fall of Margaret Pole was not just a consequence of her son Reginald's defiance. It was the execution of a strategy to eliminate the final symbolic threat to the Tudor regime. The woman who had once hosted royal banquets was now to die as a common traitor, in the damp inner ward of the Tower. But Margaret's fall was not sudden. It had taken years to engineer, a slow erosion of status, a dismantling of wealth, and a cold, calculated unraveling of her name. The first sign had come in 1535, when her household was investigated and her servants questioned about her religious practices. At the time, nothing came of it, but it set the tone. She had become visible in the worst possible way, noticed by a king who had begun to fear shadows more than enemies. She was forced to sell furniture, then lands, then jewelry. Warblington Castle, which had once rung with music and courtly chatter, grew silent. Visitors thinned. Letters stopped arriving. Even her privileges at court were slowly withdrawn. First her access to Princess Mary, then her pension. She was being erased. A woman of her pedigree and power was never going to be executed publicly without justification. Henry needed to justify the act posthumously, by labeling her a conspirator after her death, a traitor by legacy. This is why no trial was ever offered. Evidence was a risk. The justification came in the form of the so-called Exeter Conspiracy, an ill-defined plot supposedly aiming to restore the Plantagenets to the throne. It included her son Geoffrey Edward Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter, and several others. But historians still debate whether the conspiracy ever truly existed. Margaret's name was added as an accessory by association, guilt not for what she did but for who she was. Even within her imprisonment, she remained formidable. Records from her Tower confinement show she continued to refer to herself by her full title, Margaret, Countess of Salisbury. She insisted upon proper address. She refused to eat food she suspected was poisoned, requesting only bread and water during her final weeks. The slow cruelty of her treatment was not unique, but it was deliberate. She was denied basic comforts. Her cell had no fire during the winter. Her letters were intercepted. Her clothing, by one account, had grown ragged and thin, though she maintained her posture and presence. The guards, some sympathetic, noted her quiet resistance. She prayed aloud, refused to confess, and never pleaded for mercy. In courtly circles, whispers abounded. Some believed Henry's vengeance was not just political, but personal. Margaret had been loyal to Queen Catherine. She had shielded Princess Mary from Anne Boleyn's wrath. She was a symbol of a previous order, one rooted in piety, papal loyalty, and dynastic legitimacy. By killing her, Henry wasn't merely removing a rival. He was burning the last bridge to the old world. The logistics of her execution revealed the haste and carelessness of the operation. There was no scaffold constructed. No official proclamation to the city. The executioner, rumored to be an untrained deputy or even a butcher by trade, was brought in with little preparation. The usual rituals of noble death, final blessings, last speeches, ceremonial garb, were denied. There was no priest to absolve her. No family member permitted to witness her passing. What she was given instead was a crowd of courtiers who came not to grieve but to gawk. Among them was a diplomat from France who later wrote of the horror he witnessed. His account described Margaret's final moments as a slaughter, not an execution. He wrote that her cries were like the cries of a hunted animal, that she tried to resist, to move, to survive. Margaret had no intention of dying on her knees. That was her last act of rebellion. When she refused to lay her head on the ground, there was no block after all, she was seized by guards. But even then she twisted away. Witnesses claimed she turned and walked in defiance, circling the yard, forcing the executioner to chase her. One observer wrote that her final minutes were a ballet of blood, an old woman weaving between blows as if death were something she could outmaneuver. The scene was carnage, not justice, not even spectacle. Her body was butchered, not beheaded. And yet, even in death, her identity refused to be erased. The place where she fell, Tower Green, remained haunted by the memory. Later queens, including Elizabeth I, reportedly refused to walk over that spot. In the Tower Chapel, where her bones were unceremoniously dumped, later restorations uncovered remains believed to be hers, crushed, scattered, and unmarked. But her legacy survived in a different form. Reginald Pole, the son who had defied the king, would outlive Henry. He would return to England under Queen Mary, become Archbishop of Canterbury, and preside over the short-lived Catholic Restoration. And though he died without ever taking revenge, he never forgot his mother's fate. He wore a ring bearing her likeness until the day he died. Some scholars argue that Margaret was canonized in spirit, if not in name. She became a martyr to Catholic loyalists, a symbol of resistance to tyranny, and a woman whose dignity endured the savagery of power. Quirkier details have emerged over the centuries. One priest claimed that the axe used to kill her was later melted down and used in the bell of a nearby monastery, a poetic transformation of violence into prayer. Another folktale says that her ghost still walks the tower on misty mornings, hands outstretched, searching for her missing head. The truth, of course, is harder, less poetic, but more enduring. Margaret Pole was a casualty of dynastic terror, a relic of a vanishing world, and a woman whose refusal to kneel may have been her final, greatest act of faith. The headsman had never done this before. Not like this. Not to someone like her. In the courtly annals of Tudor death, execution was meant to be an art. A grisly theater, yes, but one with structure. There were expectations. Scaffolds were built. Blocks were polished. Final speeches were rehearsed. The condemned, especially nobles, were granted the trappings of dignity, even if only as a courtesy before the blade. But on May 27, 1541, none of that was offered to Margaret Pole. What unfolded on Tower Green was not execution. It was a disaster of state-sanctioned murder, botched beyond comprehension. There was no platform, only the damp grass beneath her bare feet. No cordon, no proclamations. Just a handful of onlookers assembled like ghouls at a private hanging, and an axeman with shaking hands and a dull blade. Whether the choice of executioner was deliberate humiliation or mere negligence, historians continue to argue. What's clear is this: whoever was behind that axe was not ready. Some say the man was a novice, pressed into service after the more experienced headsman fell ill. Others claim it was worse, that the executioner was drunk or intentionally careless, or that he simply panicked when faced with the reality of severing royalty from life. What we do know is this: Margaret Pole refused to kneel. This was not pride alone. It was defiance. To kneel was to accept guilt. She had committed no crime, she believed, not against her king, not against her faith, and certainly not against God. Kneeling, for her, would have been the final betrayal of truth. And so she stood. When the axeman raised the blade, she stepped aside. When he swung, she twisted. The axe missed. It struck her shoulder, splitting skin but missing the artery. A misfire that sent blood spraying in a jagged arc. Her scream, they said, was not high or piercing but guttural. Fury more than fear. She turned toward him. Spoke Latin. A prayer? A curse? No one knows. The second blow followed, rushed and desperate. It clipped her back. She staggered. Third, into the side of her skull. Still, she didn't fall completely. Witnesses recall she tried to run. Not far. Her legs were thin and weak with age, but enough to make the headsman chase her. A 67-year-old woman, soaked in her own blood, stumbling across the grass in her shift, while a man with an axe stumbled behind her, swinging blindly. It became a farce of horror, a grotesque parody of justice. The fourth strike struck the ribs. The fifth cut shallow into the lower back. The sixth, the one that should have been final, only opened more sinew. Each blow was accompanied by gasps, by groans, by a growing, suffocating silence. Even the birds had gone quiet. One chronicler claimed that a noblewoman fainted at the sight. Another said the queen's physician, present by command, turned and vomited into the grass. The blood soaked into the earth, thick and slow, while Margaret moaned, breathing raggedly between each cut. The shift she wore, once white, turned crimson, clinging to her thin frame like wet parchment. It took 11 strikes before her head finally detached. And even then it was not a clean severance. Her face, they said, was left partially intact, jaw slack, one eye still open as if in disbelief. The executioner dropped the head, then bent to retrieve it with bloodied hands, only to slip in the gore and fall beside the corpse. They dragged her body away unceremoniously. No linen wrapping. No priest's blessing. Her head and torso were tossed onto a cart as if clearing butcher's leavings. This was not just death, it was obliteration. And yet, in the twisted logic of Henry VIII's court, it had served its purpose. The message was clear. No one was above suspicion. No family name, however ancient, would shield you. No service, no piety, no past loyalty could buy forgiveness. Margaret Pole had not plotted treason. She had not raised armies or penned declarations. Her crime was symbolic. She existed as the last Plantagenet standing. And in Tudor England, symbolism killed as surely as swords. This was not an isolated brutality. It fit into a pattern, a crescendo of state paranoia that peaked in Henry's later years. Anne Boleyn, Cromwell, Thomas More, Catherine Howard, each fell in turn. But Margaret's death stood out not for its cause but its chaos. Executions were supposed to end debates. Hers began one. Even among Henry's court, there were murmurs of disapproval. Foreign ambassadors wrote in horror. The French, famously cruel in their own executions, called the act shameful. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was Reginald Pole's patron, used the event in diplomatic attacks against Henry, calling it proof of English barbarism. But perhaps the most haunting consequence of all was the silence that followed. No poems were written. No elegies read. Margaret's surviving family went underground. Her name was whispered only behind closed doors, often followed by the sign of the cross. Those who had served her erased their connections. Her portraits vanished. It was a political purge through and through. And yet, her ghost would not go quietly. In later centuries, writers and clerics revived her name as a symbol of martyrdom. She was remembered in Catholic circles as a woman of unshakable faith, condemned for her silence, not her speech. Paintings of her final moments, often sanitized, showed her kneeling calmly in pure white, offering herself to God. But that was not the truth. The truth was horror. The truth was blood and confusion and screaming and 11 strokes of a blade that never should have been lifted. One fringe account, almost certainly apocryphal, claimed the axe was later discovered buried beneath the tower floor during a renovation centuries later, still stained, the wood warped by time. Another claimed that each year, on the anniversary of her death, flowers bloomed blood-red in the soil outside her execution site, and wilted by noon. There is no evidence for either. But the persistence of such stories tells its own truth. Margaret Pole's death refused to be forgotten. Time did not bury her. It only deepened the wound. Long after the blood on Tower Green had dried, long after Henry VIII's bones were entombed in Windsor, Margaret Pole's story lingered, like rot beneath polished marble. In the centuries that followed, scholars, priests, poets, and politicians would return to her tale with fascination and unease. No one could agree on what she meant. But everyone agreed on one thing. Her death was not normal. It was not just. It was a stain. In the decades immediately following her execution, Margaret's legacy became a ghost story weapon for both sides of England's great religious divide. To Catholics, she was a martyr, slaughtered because of her faith, her loyalty to the Pope, and her unwavering support for Queen Catherine and Princess Mary. To Protestant reformers, she was a relic, dangerous not because of faith but because of family, a living link to the Plantagenets, a woman who reminded the nation that the Tudors had stolen their crown on a battlefield soaked in blood, not inherited it from God. Even her bones became contentious. When Queen Victoria ordered restorations of the tower's chapel in the 1870s, bones were discovered beneath the chancel floor, jumbled, scattered, anonymous. Among them, the remains of an elderly woman, with evidence of blunt trauma to the skull and shoulder. They reburied her. Marked the site as Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, executed 1541. But there was no peace in the dirt. Each generation revisited her death as if the bones themselves were still whispering. Historians still debate, was her son Reginald Pole's letter to the Pope the final straw that sealed her doom? Was her execution time to distract from the scandal surrounding Catherine Howard, whom Henry had just discovered was unfaithful? Was it about politics, religion, or simply Henry's obsessive need to control every narrative? French historians point to strange details in the records. The unusual timing, the amateur executioner, the lack of official eyewitness testimony. Some suggest she was meant to die slowly, that it was punishment for refusing to betray her son. Others believe she was meant to be quietly disappeared, but someone mismanaged the script, and the violence became public. Whatever the case, one thing is undeniable. Her execution horrified even a generation numb to horror. This wasn't just the death of a noblewoman. It was the grotesque unraveling of Tudor justice in its most paranoid, self-devouring phase. Margaret Pole's body became a canvas upon which the failures of a regime were painted in gore. The irony? Henry VIII did not long survive her. Within 6 years he too would die, bloated, ulcerated and alone, haunted by ghosts of wives, friends and enemies. Reginald Pole, Margaret's son, would return to England under Queen Mary's reign as Archbishop of Canterbury. He would preach reconciliation, not revenge. But he would never speak his mother's name aloud in public. Some wounds were too raw. And yet, the image of her final hour endured. She became the subject of ballads, most of them lost. A few survive in fragments, tucked into Catholic manuscripts. One reads, 11 cuts for one still heart. The red did bloom from royal part. No crime she sang, no curse she spat. A crownless queen beheaded flat. Later accounts tried to soften the blow. Victorian hagiographers painted her as saintly, gentle, composed. But these revisions stripped her of agency. Margaret Pole was not a delicate martyr. She was a lioness, cornered, aging and unwilling to bow. She met death like a soldier of memory, unrepentant, unbending and furiously alive until the last stroke. There are now plaques bearing her name. Memorials. Candles lit in churches across England on May 27th. And in the Tower of London gift shop, you can find her name listed among the tragic noblewomen who fell within its walls. But no souvenir can capture the true horror of that day. No polished bookplate can explain how a grandmother of English nobility was hacked to pieces like livestock. And no monument, however tall, can erase the silence that followed her death, because it wasn't just about Margaret Pole. It was about fear. Fear of bloodlines that ran too deep. Fear of voices that refused to recant. Fear of what it meant to be a woman who remembered too much. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all. Margaret was executed not for what she did, but for what she meant. She was a living contradiction, royalty without allegiance, piety without compromise, and a matriarch who would not kneel. Her death was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it began a legend. In the stillness that followed her final breath, the tower was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels like a held breath, long, trembling, and unnatural. Fog clung to the stones for hours after her body was carried away. And though the sun rose and the city stirred, something heavy remained in the air, like a room where a terrible argument had just ended. No birds sang above Tower Green that day. The crows, usually eager for scraps, stayed distant, watching. There are those who say that the grass in that part of the yard never grew right again. That the soil retained her blood like a scar. That children who walked by it felt uneasy, as though they had wandered into someone else's bad memory. But with time, even the tower forgets. Stones settle. Dust erases footprints. The past becomes suggestion, shadows on the wall of a chapel few enter. And yet her name persists. Margaret Pole. Countess. Mother. Survivor. Victim. Symbol. The world she knew is gone, but the lessons remain. That power wielded without mercy always devours itself. That silence can be louder than confession. And that some spirits refuse to fade quietly. So if you ever visit the Tower of London and the morning fog is heavy, stop by the chapel. Place your hand on the cold stone floor. And listen. You may not hear her. But somewhere beneath your feet, England remembers.